It is a great privilege to introduce as my guest Allen C. Guelzo. Professor Guelzo is the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar in the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's the author of 15 books, among them 5 books on Abraham Lincoln, and a recent biography of Robert E. Lee. He also wrote Fateful Lightning, which is a history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. I have read and profited from each of these books, but on a personal level, I am particularly grateful to the professor for his lectures on the great courses. I listened to those pretty constantly for a while, and they caused me to quit my job as a professor and start a historical walking tour company, which became Bowtie Tours and now gives all of the tours for the top hotels, including Four Seasons and the Ritz. And so if my wife wants to know why I quit being a lawyer to be a tour guide, this is the reason right here. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm not sure if that doesn't mean that I'm now to blame for any misfortunes which may have come your way. I feel like I ought to start by apologizing.
Well, no misfortunes. It's been a fantastic trip. I tell people it's the opposite of being a lawyer because everyone's in a good mood who comes to me and they actually kind of want to be there. So I have no complaints whatsoever to make. Now, you begin your book by stating that we are living in a time of shadows. Can you explain what it is exactly that you mean by that?
Everywhere I go today, and I'm sure this is the experience for many of the watchers of your podcast, people talk today about crisis. They talk about anxiety. They talk about how democracy is in danger, how we need to save democracy. That creates, in many people's minds, a level almost amounting to fear for what is liable to come in the short term. And in that sense of shadow, that sense of cloud, that ominous feeling that something is not right with the ship and we don't know what we're steering toward, that created a background to which I wanted to write this book, to speak as much to my own concerns as to the questions and concerns that are raised so often to me by others. So there is a sense of shadow, there is a sense of anxiety, that we face a peculiar kind of crisis. To that crisis, I wanted to allow the voice of a great American to speak, and that was Abraham Lincoln, who also faced a time of tremendous crisis, greater, I think, than anything we could easily imagine or compare to today. When you put it in the context of what Lincoln led us through in the 1860s, our own questions and our own problems begin to shrink in proportion, which is a good thing. And seeing how he dealt with democracy, what he thought about it, how he used the term, what he thought its components were, and how he realistically faced up to its deficits and weak points. All of these taken together, I think, provide, first of all, instruction for us. But secondly, they also provide a measure of encouragement that this thing that we call democracy, which is as important as anything can be in public life, is not, in fact, weak, frail, fragile, and trembling, but in fact has a measure of strength and resilience in it, not unlike the strength and resilience exhibited by Abraham Lincoln. If I, in some small measure, can persuade people of that, then I will consider that the book has been a success.
And I'm just thinking, as you say that, of course, one of the issues we have today is this complete division and arguments and lack of agreement. And Abraham Lincoln is this interesting person that kind of goes beyond that. And I noticed that Bill Clinton would constantly read books about Abraham Lincoln when he was president, and George W. Bush would constantly read books about Abraham Lincoln. And I think it's almost like reading great Shakespeare, that his stuff was so immense that dealing with the impeachment for President Clinton, or Iraq with President Bush, you look towards Lincoln, and it seems like it's not so bad.
Right. Now, there is, of course, a weakness to that, and that is Lincoln is facing a tremendous crisis. So many of these other crises seem to shrink by comparison. That doesn't mean that they're unimportant. And that can be one false conclusion we come to, that crises that we face today don't really require the kinds of energy that we might fear they do. That would have, I think, a negative effect. It would lull us to sleep. Lincoln can encourage, Lincoln can direct. It doesn't mean that we don't need to address difficulties ourselves, but we can address them using Lincolnian tools, Lincolnian attitudes, Lincolnian words. And that, I think, will give us some guidance as we do, in fact, deal and confront with crisis in our own times.
Another thing you talk about at the very beginning of your book, which I was curious about, is how your life has changed in terms of being the life of a scholar. How it's a little different than it used to be, and in not a very good way, it sounds like. If you could explain that.
I look back over a career in higher education that now amounts to almost 40 years. And a great deal has changed within that. There are some things which have not. A semester is still a semester. A syllabus is still a syllabus. Grades and grading papers are still grades and grading papers at the end of each term. But a great deal has happened within American higher education since I first became part of it. And a lot of it is very unhappy. I think unhappy in two ways. One way in which it has become unhappy is simply demographic. And this is something I began writing about 6 to 10 years ago. I wrote for instance, a long op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in 2018, issuing a warning. We are heading for a demographic cliff in which the numbers of the available 18 to 22-year-olds is shrinking, and shrinking in substantial proportions. This is a shrinkage which is going to make itself first felt in the Northeast and in the Great Lakes region. And at that time, I said, institutions are going to have to start accommodating themselves to this fact. Well, I can't say that I was hailed as a prophet, but what has happened over the last decade has been very sad in this respect, because we have seen, in fact, I can hardly open my morning newsletter from the Chronicle of Higher Education without reading tidings of colleges closing, or programs within colleges being severely cut back, staff being left off, faculty being laid off. And that has created a very different landscape for higher education than when I first entered it. So that throws one cloud over higher education. A second cloud has been the radical politicization of so many campuses. And on campuses, there's always politics, because on campuses, there's always ideas, and there are always ideas of politics. But now the allegiance to ideas and to systems and parties has acquired an almost cult-like intensity. And you begin to find groups of people no longer interested in listening to each other, no longer interested in listening to each other. We have the prevalence of cancel culture. And I have seen decisions made in the coldest and the most heartless ways, purely on the basis of whether someone is perceived, not even whether someone is, but whether someone is perceived to be of a certain political direction or a certain political orientation. That has created a sadness of heart at the core of the university, because the core of the university is not about activism. Activism is something you may do once you have left the university, once you have acquired an education in the university. But whether it should actually be part of university life, whether it should occupy the place that it does, I think is highly questionable. I think the university, I think the college, whatever institution of higher education, is a place where one concentrates on pursuing truth. And then when you have established in your own mind where the directions of truth lie, that's the moment to step outside the institution and then take that into actual practice and see what the results are. But within the institution itself, unless our institutions are institutions that are dedicated to the unfettered pursuit of truth, then what we have done is to crush the spirit out of them. In fact, to set at naught the whole reason that colleges and universities have existed in the first place. And that, even more than the demographic cliff that we have already gone over, I think creates an atmosphere on American campuses that doesn't allow the deep breath of thinking and the pursuit of truth to take place. There is a severe problem, and this is felt across the boards. This is not simply me complaining. I read this over and over again, not only in the trade publications of higher education, but even now this has become the substance of op-ed columns in the New York Times and the Washington Post and many other prominent publications. There really is a sense that higher education has come to a serious fork in the road, and that the directions that it has pursued over the last decades can no longer be pursued in the same way. Some decisions are going to have to be made. Some clarifications are going to have to come to hand.
And some of the problems start much earlier than higher education. I know that when I was a kid, we talked about history from kindergarten on. And I give tours to people from all over the country, and usually they don't bump up against American history till the 7th grade. And it's usually after world history. It's almost treated like a little addendum to what they had. And it feels like they have much less focus or concern or care of American history. American history is not put on the standardized tests, which in and of itself is meaningless, but it's kind of telling people, how important is this? This isn't even something they test these kids on.
Well, I see the product of this in students over the years who have come to me in classrooms with what strikes me as an appalling lack of preparation in American history. And why has that taken place? Part of it, I suppose, has to be laid at the feet of the education schools. They have not prioritized this, and this is a sad thing to say. Part of it, I think, also is the pressure that comes from bureaucrats and administrators who are anxious that students coming up through the K through 12 grades concentrate on doing things that are going to make for greater efficiency. So that STEM, for instance, has seemed to crowd out so many other aspects of education. Well, all honor to STEM in its own right. I think it's important that people know how to get from 2 to 2 to 4. Yet at the same time, that's not the whole story. The purpose of education is not to create an army of worker bees. The purpose of education is to lead people, quite literally from the Latin, it is to lead people out of themselves. And it seems to me this is especially true for what we think that education should do in a democracy. A democracy just doesn't happen on its own. A democracy has to be the product of people reflecting on who they are as citizens, what their responsibilities are or will be, and what the examples are from the past. This is especially true for Americans because we don't define ourselves in terms of race or soil or blood or throne or altar. We don't do any of those things that the ancient nations of Europe have done, and ancient nations in other places as well. We define ourselves as Americans by a set of propositions. And when you reflect on that, this is an utterly remarkable thing. How do you make a nation? based on simple statements. Back in the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, many people in Europe thought this was simply hilarious. How could Americans ever expect to create a nation simply on the basis of what Joseph de Maistre called, scornfully, tracts of ink on paper? How do you make a nation out of a Declaration of Independence? How do you make a nation out of a constitution? People thought that in the latter part of the 18th century and into the 19th century, that this was simply an impossibility. And yet Americans went and did it. We don't have, therefore, the kinds of hard elements that many other nations have to appeal to for who they are and why they are there. We have our history. We have those propositions and the history which gave them birth. That is what gives us our identity. It's sometimes said that it takes 1,200 years to make a Frenchman, but you can become an American in 20 minutes. And you can. Why? You read those propositions in the Declaration of Independence. You read the Constitution. You sign on to those things and you're there. But to do that, how critical it is to understand our history. Because, and here's the word I'll leave you with on this, who we are is who we were. And never is that more the case than in a democracy built on those propositions.
Of course, one of the problems we have is what's going on in all levels of society, which is less of an ability to have critical thinking. And I'll see things on the internet, which just puts something out there without any kind of depth, or it might say the Democrats were opposed to freeing slaves in 1860, right? And leave it at that. I heard this great quote from Prince, the singer, and he said, well, I just learned that George Washington was not the first president. So I don't know if you've seen that, but because there were presidents of Congress before the Constitution, and that's been on the internet, Washington wasn't the first president, right? So he said, I now realize everything I ever learned in school was a lie, right? So it didn't occur to him, the guy who told him George Washington wasn't the first president lied. He said, everything I've ever heard was a lie because George Washington was not the first president.
No, someone has equipped him with a factoid, and he has allowed the factoid to run loose on the landscape. It reminds me of the story about the man who said on the phone at his desk, "What do you mean that $1,000 billion is a billion? Why wasn't I informed of this?" There's a certain touching simplicity to it, I have to admit. You want to almost reach out and say, there, let me explain this to you. But on the other hand, unfortunately, the internet had great promise 20 years ago, or at least advertised itself as having great promise about bringing a more democratized atmosphere to public communication. And in some ways, it's had exactly the opposite result. It has, in fact, multiplied the ease with which factoids spread throughout all the connections of the net, the great information superhighway. And it's the factoids, which themselves may not actually be wrong, but which lack any kind of balance, context, or wider understanding of what's meant. I mean, when we say Washington was not the first president, all right, very literally, that's true. There were people who were president of Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Simply because we called the presiding officer of the Continental Congress or the Confederation Congress a president does not mean that's the same as the president under the Constitution. I mean, the term president actually bubbles up for the very first time when the first Continental Congress assembles in Philadelphia in 1774. And that's the term that's used to designate the person who was going to chair the meeting of the Congress. The definition of the term president is today extraordinarily different, was different even in Washington's time from what had been the original use of the term president in 1774. Now, explaining that requires a bit more bandwidth than the internet sometimes gives us. Sometimes you just want to say, slow down and understand there's another sentence following.
Yeah. And it would really be that much. You could explain it in 5 minutes. It's not a, but anyway, another kind of funny thing you might like, but before I quit being a lawyer, one of my last cases, I won this motion and on a drug case, and we walked out and I was talking to the client. I said, well, I'm going to teach about American history. And he said, what have they ever done for me? And I said, do you realize the funny thing was he was guilty, but he was released by a motion and everyone knew he was guilty. And I said, that doesn't happen everywhere, that the government pays to represent you against the government and you get to walk out even though they know you did it. And he kind of thought about it a little.
Well, here again is part of what I mean when I say that as Americans, what gives us our identity? Our identity doesn't come from race, it doesn't come from language, it doesn't come from an established church. Our identity comes from these propositions that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln talked about this at Gettysburg on November 19th, 1863, when he was speaking at the dedication of the cemetery there, that this nation is a nation founded on a proposition, that the Civil War itself was being fought as a challenge to that proposition. Sometimes you want to say when people have the attitude or the words, like, what has history ever done for me? My response is, look, it got us to the place we're at today. It might be a good idea if we understood how we got here. If you suddenly find yourself when you're driving around, let's say in Nevada or Arizona, in a very deserted place, and suddenly you realize you don't quite know where you're at, it might be a good idea to consult a map. Well, in that sense, history is a map of how we got to this very perplexing moment that we're at today. It tells us where we are.
And my last real concern I want to throw at you about the history before we go on, it has to do with the more recent history. For instance, I visited each of the presidential libraries, and of course, you're familiar with Robert Caro and what he's done with Lyndon Johnson. Well, they still have not released the vast multitude of records on George Herbert Walker Bush's library, because now it has to go through government processes of being released ever since Ronald Reagan. I kind of tell all of you bigwigs this because I'm hoping somebody will start to mention that we've lost the opportunity to write that book on George Herbert Walker Bush. They're gone now. You can't get the records and then go talk to the person. President Obama's library is going to have no archives, the first one since Calvin Coolidge. And I asked David Garrow, who wrote a tremendous book on President Obama, pre-president years. I said, well, why would he not want to have archives? And he said, he doesn't want anyone else to write about him. He wants to be the only one that does so. Nobody has written a book on George W. Bush, which is possibly the most eventful presidency in our lifetime, certainly in my lifetime. So I'm just wondering, when you look at history and where it's going, beyond that, of course, none of these people write letters. How are people going to write the history of people today, or are we just giving up on that and we're just going to have books about Grant and Roosevelt and recycle them ad nauseum, but never have a book on George W. Bush?
Well, I think we will have a book on George W. Bush. And I'm also aware of the fact that for many of the other presidents, there are all kinds of limitations that have been put on access to their documents, not legal entanglements, but other kinds of entanglements. To give you an example from Lincoln, after Lincoln's death, all the personal papers that he had as president were bundled up, locked away in footlockers, and were taken off to Illinois by his son, Robert Todd Lincoln. And for all of Robert Todd Lincoln's life, Lincoln's papers, his presidential papers, and in fact a good deal else, were all the property of Robert Todd Lincoln. There was no statute that covered them. There was no statute that required that they be turned over to some kind of federal depository for keeping. So Robert Todd Lincoln goes through his whole life as the possessor of his father's papers, and he is extremely reluctant to give any kind of researcher or biographer access to those papers. He will only really do that for two people, John Nicolay and John Hay, who collaborate in writing what you could call the official biography of Abraham Lincoln at the end of the 19th century. Robert Todd Lincoln wills his father's papers to the Library of Congress, but with a 21-year stipulation that the papers would not be accessible, even though they were in the hands of the Library of Congress. They would not be accessible until 1947. Finally, the papers get opened, and by that point, people have spent decades speculating on what might be in them. Always the assumption is the reason that Robert Todd Lincoln kept them so much to himself and put that 21-year ban on access was because they were all full of salacious material. And people opened them up in 1947 in a famous ceremony at the Library of Congress. And there was nothing much that people didn't already know. It was the mail in, the mail out, the inbox, the outbox of Lincoln's presidency. So it was great to have all those papers, but were there any salacious discoveries? No, which in turn set off speculation that there had been salacious papers, but Robert Todd Lincoln destroyed them. Is that possible? Well, of course it is possible. So there are limitations on the kind of research we can do, even for presidents like Lincoln. And I think back, what about the papers of, let's say, William Henry Harrison? What about the papers of John Tyler? Those are fairly few and far between. That has not prevented us from writing biographies of them. And it's not prevented diligent researchers from finding materials in odds and ends of places. Even with Lincoln, to this day, we continue to find things. And I, in fact, just wrote 2 short articles for the newsletter of the Abraham Lincoln Association about 2 new discoveries of Lincoln-related papers. So on the one hand, you're right. It's very frustrating, and you scratch your head and you say, why won't they give us access? Then you wonder if it's all email, is it going to disappear somewhere? Is someone going to use some kind of wash that's going to eliminate them? That's always a possibility. But you know something, David? I'm afraid that's always been a possibility with presidential papers. Before there were programs to eliminate documents or electronic documents in email, there was the fireplace. And that worked just as well. So we're not actually in all that different a position, much less a more hopeless position.
It was that great story about 10 years ago. Someone bought 7 completed Abraham Lincoln letters for 75 cents at a garage sale because the husband never told the wife what he had.
I know. This happens all the time. I wrote several years ago a biography of Robert E. Lee. I was straying a bit out of my Lincoln lane, largely because I wanted to look at this thing called the Civil War from the other end of the telescope. What I discovered was that Robert E. Lee was a compulsive letter writer. The man must have written as many as 6,000 letters in his lifetime. But there was no central archive. There were a handful of large collections, but lots of other Lee letters were scattered all across the country in little penny packets from the Morgan Library in New York to the Huntington Library in San Marino. And I had to go chase them all down. And sometimes I had to go make the trips to them. Sometimes an obliging librarian would make some photocopies, and you might get 6 letters here, 6 letters there. And then on top of it, there were the letters that turned up on the auction websites. And I ended up with 2 friends who regularly monitored those auction websites. If they saw anything about Lee, they alerted me. Not that I was going to buy the letters. They're a little too expensive. But at least the auction sites would frequently give you a transcript of the letter. That was what I was after. What was really surprising is how much material was scattered in so many different places and was really not even in public hands. So the travails of a researcher are not easy, even dealing with what seem to be perfectly obvious figures from the American past. It won't be easier for biographers of modern prominent political leaders, but all I can say is, welcome to the labors. We're all doing the same thing. And in fact, we're all doing the same thing that Herodotus was doing for the Greeks long ago.
So you begin your book with some of the comments about democracy. John Adams said that every democracy eventually commits suicide. You put what James Madison had to say. So the founders, if you talked about democracy, they would not have used that word in a very positive way.
No, no.
How does that change? How does that become this point where we all think of ourselves, as you've talked about, protecting our democracy? How do we shift from seeing it as a bad thing to us thinking this is an intrinsic part of being American?
The founders were dicey on the subject of democracy because when we use the term democracy, we almost invariably use it in a very positive sense. But for the founders, what they read in history didn't always point in that direction. The first great example of democratic government, of course, was Athens, and Athens in its golden age, when all the citizens of Athens were entitled to participate in the city assembly, in the government, the direct government of Athens itself. Well, that had its ups and its downs. The up, so to speak, was that every citizen of Athens had a role to play, both in the assembly, as members of juries. It was a very comprehensive situation in which everyone had a place, everyone had a responsibility, civically speaking, to occupy themselves. And yet it had its down moments. And James Madison was among the first to remind people of that. He observed, of course, that this Athenian democracy was the same Athenian democracy, the same Athenian assembly that condemned Socrates to death. So Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers that democracy is not where we should be going in terms of our new government. Democracy, he said, reminded him of this, that if every Athenian had been a Socrates, the assembly would still have been a mob. So that concerned him. Democracies can be carried away. The will of the people is a fine thing, but if the people themselves are not exercising their responsibilities wisely, then the end can be very bad. What Madison and the founders understood that they were doing was creating a republic. And in their minds, there was a bright division between a democracy and a republic. Democracies and republics share the same basic contention, and that is that sovereignty, political sovereignty, resides in the people. But it's manifested in a very different way in a democracy and a republic. In a democracy, it's direct. The people actually have control and oversight and voting on the issues of the day. That works, Madison said, but only works in a very small environment, very controlled environment, a very face-to-face environment, like the city of Athens itself. They understood that what they were dealing with was a much larger phenomenon. Even these newly independent 13 states were far, far larger, both in terms of geography and of people, than ancient Athens. They turned instead to the example of Rome and the Roman Republic. A republic is still built on that basic premise. Sovereignty emerges from the people. But a republic says that it is manifested through their representatives. In other words, there's a middling layer. And this middling layer is to be composed of those who are wise and prudent and prominent. And these wise representatives, they will enact the laws that in Athens had been directly enacted by the assembly. And Madison thought that would act as a restraint on some of the follies of democracy. Therefore, for the founders, it was a republic that they wanted to found. And they thought there was a very clear and obvious distinction between the two. That is, of course, what the Constitution embodies. It is the government of a republic. It's built upon representation. And yet, and yet, these Americans had always governed themselves, even as colonies, in very direct ways. Each one of what had been the 13 colonies had their own legislature, and these legislatures acted for themselves. And yes, they acted as representative, they acted as miniature republics. And yet, these colonial assemblies were very close to the people. They were not drawn from some lofty elite class, because in America, there wasn't a lofty elite class, certainly not anything comparable to what could have been found in England. That meant that Americans had a habit of government, which, yes, it was structured in the way of a republic, but functioned frequently in the way of a democracy. And you see this even in comments that are made by Alexander Hamilton during the Revolution, when he speaks of the New York State Constitution, for instance, as being a democratical Republican constitution. It's a republic that has a strong leaning toward democracy. When we move out of the era of the founders, what we find is that process accelerates. That in America, the idea that you're electing representatives who speak for some kind of great elite class of the wise and the lofty, there just isn't a class of the wise and the lofty, such as there is in Europe. And therefore, what happens is that the American Republic becomes very quickly more and more democratic, to the point where the two terms fuse and people begin using them interchangeably. As early as 1830, when Alexis de Tocqueville comes to America to observe the operation of this American experiment in government, he writes one of the classic volumes analyzing American political life. It's one that I wish people still had as assigned reading today. But he entitles his book Democracy in America, not Republicanism in America, Democracy in America, because Tocqueville saw already by the 1830s the American Republic, yes, structurally speaking, it's a republic, but the spirit within it is very much the spirit of a democracy. 30 years on from that, we get to Abraham Lincoln in his first inaugural address. And how does he describe the American government, both there and in his special message of July 4th, 1861? He speaks of us as a democratical republic, as a constitutional democracy. By Lincoln's day, the terms democracy and republic have become virtually interchangeable. And why? Because we are, yes, a republic, but we are a very democratical republic. So I would say, think of republic as the noun that describes us, but think of democratic, think of democracy as the adjective that defines what kind of republic we are. That is what we had become by Abraham Lincoln's day, and he acknowledges that.
And yet you've chosen kind of a difficult person because he doesn't use the word democracy very much. And his one definition of democracy is very intriguing, which you say is somewhat awkward, which is based exactly on slavery, indicating that he believes that slavery is the antithesis of democracy, and that it's almost the definitional point of democracy.
Lincoln doesn't use the word democracy more than 137 times in the 8 volumes of his collected writings and the standard 1953 edition edited by Roy Basler. And that seems like a fairly small proportion. Why wouldn't he be talking more about it? Well, he doesn't actually use the term democracy more than that because he doesn't need to. Democracy has now become the way that Americans talk about their government. And it can be taken for granted that what he's talking about is democracy. He doesn't need to stop and give definitions to people, because that's already what's there right in front of him. The definition he does give is, curiously enough, a definition that combines both politics and economics, because it's about slavery. And it's the definition he writes out on a slip of paper. We think at the very beginning of the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. And he says very simply, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Now he's talking about an economic relationship there, right? Okay. He then says, this expresses my idea of democracy. So he has used a discussion, a very brief one sentence, of an economic reality, and then moves to talking about its comparison to politics. I think that's, for one thing, that indicates to us how very close Lincoln believed economics and politics lived to each other. But it also says, this is the great challenge. This economic system of slavery is the great challenge to democracy, because what festers inside slavery are attitudes and practices which are completely at odds with the attitudes and practices, politically speaking, of democracy. So this expresses my idea of democracy. Don't be a slave, don't be a master. Whatever differs from this, he says, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Now, that's probably not the kind of definition that you'd look for in a dictionary. But it does express for him what was the key issue in democracy, facing the American democracy in his lifetime, and especially there in 1858.
And Lincoln, you write a lot about Lincoln's interest in economics and what we would call capitalism today, and the idea that in America you can be working for somebody and then you can hire people. And to him, what we would call capitalism and slavery don't coexist. Whereas, and I know you've written about the 1619 Project, and with certain of those writers posit the idea that capitalism and slavery go hand in hand, and that slavery was continued because it was a part of capitalism. And Lincoln seems to believe the exact opposite of that.
And Lincoln was right. And I say that Lincoln was right fundamentally for two reasons. One is, slavery as an economic system is sneaky. It can insinuate itself into any number of political regimes. That doesn't mean, though, that it's necessarily friendly to them. Sometimes it can eat their guts out. And that is particularly true in terms of a democracy. This is why Lincoln says, slaves, masters, you can't have that relationship and have a democracy. Ultimately, there's going to have to be collision there. Well, this for Lincoln was also true if you considered economics, strictly speaking. In fact, go beyond consulting Lincoln. Consult the slave owners themselves. They were not shy about saying that what slavery represented was the antithesis of capitalism. Take the opinions. They're there. Read them. Read George Fitzhugh's Sociology for the South. Read Fitzhugh's Cannibals All. Read the writings of the pro-slavery propagandists of the 1840s and the 1850s. They'll tell you frankly, they hate capitalism. They hate capitalism because capitalism is always about transformation. Capitalism is about someone starting poor, becoming rich. It's also a story about some people who are rich, especially people who inherit richness and wealth, and who lose it. We sometimes say in a capitalist system that you go from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. In capitalism, you can rise very quickly. In capitalism, you can also collapse very quickly. And I have known and I have seen examples of that. Well, the slave owner is basically saying, we don't like that kind of mobility. We don't like, what we want is stasis. Stasis in which someone who is born into a certain condition stays in that condition for the rest of their life. So if you're born a slave, you're going to stay a slave until you take your last breath. That means also, and this is where they took comfort, If you're a slave owner, then you're going to stay a slave owner until you take your last breath. Nothing is going to disturb that. Lincoln looks at this and says, this is a contradiction of democracy. It's also a contradiction of capitalism. For him, however much we want to criticize his view of that relationship, Lincoln was firmly convinced that the two work together, that a system of economic self-transformation was exactly parallel to what you have in a democracy, which opens up all kinds of doors for people to transform themselves politically. Someone can start out poor, not only in the sense of dollars and cents, but poor in terms of their social status. They can make something more of themselves in a free and open and fluid environment. And Lincoln found that to be true for himself. When Lincoln wanted to offer an example of what he was talking about, of the contradiction between slavery and capitalism, slavery and democracy, his exhibit A, so to speak, David, in front of a jury, was himself and his own life. He had been born about as poor as you could be born. And yet, look at the trajectory of his life. He was born in an environment that, growing up as an adolescent, he could be put out to work by his father, and everything he earned had to be turned over to his father. He called that slavery. He once made a comment later in life, I used to be a slave. Now, that wasn't because he had shackles and chains. It's because he wasn't allowed to keep anything that he had earned. But he said, now I am so free that they let me practice law. Well, he was making a joke. But at the same time, as so very often in Lincoln's jokes, they did have a point. And his point was self-transformation is the key. And if you want a consistent environment of self-transformation, where people can make of themselves something entirely new and different, then the capitalist environment, and he doesn't use the word capitalist because capitalism as an ism, the term really hasn't been invented yet. He uses the term free labor. The system of free labor and the system of democracy, in his mind, they are two sides of the same coin. And as I say, the proof of it is, look what the arguments were being put forward in defense of slavery. They were both skeptical of democracy. You find this over and over again, and skeptical of transformation. They just didn't want transformation. So I have read with some unease, let us say, what has been said in the 1619 Project, and not only 1619 is only one example of a variety of authors today who are sometimes called the new historians of capitalism. And I think the conclusion that they come to suits perhaps the atmosphere and the attitudes of the early 21st century, but I don't think it nearly describes the attitudes and the energy of Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the 19th.
And it creates the reverse that's also in the school, so that you have the 1619, or you have the people who don't want to mention anything that puts America in a bad light. And so we have this warring going on in the schools, which makes me understand why teachers are scared to even teach history these days.
I know. And it's so easy to find oneself falling off one side of the horse, getting up on the horse and falling off the other side. You can go from one extreme to the other. Lincoln was not unaware that there were deficiencies in the American experiment. I mean, after all, he is campaigning against slavery. He thinks that there is something wrong in what is going on in the America of his day. He's not shy about saying it, and he doesn't feel that, in fact, that he's doing any damage to the affection that citizens should have for their country by pointing this out. And his resolution of that, his sense of the nobility of what the American experiment is about, on the one hand, and the flaws in its practice, the way he binds them together is to speak of America as a land of aspiration. He cites this one passage from the Gospels, be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And what he means by that is, we are told, religiously and spiritually speaking, that we should strive to be perfect as God is perfect. Well, we're not going to achieve that perfection, but we should aspire to it. We should work at it. We should keep pushing ourselves in that direction. And Lincoln has the same thing to say in terms of our politics. So he makes this comparison. That word, be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is imperfect, is perfect. Make that the guide for what you do politically. Try to make your immediate political situation more perfectly democratic. He asks in one of his speeches rhetorically, can we not all do better? Is this not something which is a decision that is going to be made, not just for our situation now, but for generations into the future? So he's asking people to think, what kind of future do we want to create? What kind of future do we want other generations to walk into? So he finds that middle path between the imperfections and the aspirations. He finds it in that path of saying, be ye perfect. Can we not all do better? And the answer to that question is yes. Does that mean that we need to be embarrassed about it? No, we're simply saying this is what human beings are like. Human beings and human societies contain these imperfections. The great thing is that you live in a society where you are free to identify those imperfections, where by identifying them, you don't find the police knocking on your door at the middle of the night and saying, oh, you could not say that. You're not allowed to say that. You can't embarrass the leader. No, the remarkable thing about American society and American democracy is its resilience. It realizes it makes mistakes. It then turns around and works to cure the mistakes. To see that over and over again. Yes, if what you expect out of your political system is perfection and my country right or wrong, but still my country, then yes, it's going to seem terrible to raise any kind of question about it. And yet Lincoln raised questions. He raised questions because he wanted it to be better and because he was confident it could be better. And by raising the questions, that is how you make it better. I think that is a word that for many of us today, we need to take seriously, both from those who want to say, oh, the American experiment was hopelessly corrupt from the very beginning. This is the 1619 message, or that voice which wants to say America was always perfect and it was God's gift to the human race as it was. And that is a form of the most rancid nationalism that we could possibly encounter. People sometimes ask me, are you a nationalist? I had this question put to me in an interview where someone I think really wanted to pin me hard, like one of those butterflies in a display. My response was, if I am a nationalist, I'm a Lincolnian nationalist, in the sense that I understand that the American experiment in democracy is a rare and marvelous thing. I also understand that my nation is a nation conceived in liberty. And to the extent that my nation serves that cause of liberty, then I am its unabashed admirer. The moment when it strays from the path of liberty, then I become its critic, its healthy critic, because I want it to be better and know that it can be better. That is the middle path I think Lincoln trod. I think it's the middle path that all of us really, for our own sake and for the sake of generations to come, must also tread as well.
Of course, teaching about Lincoln, as you do, you teach a course on Lincoln, you've put out a lecture series on Lincoln, is the difficulty we have in microcosm in terms of a person who has good moments and bad moments when it comes to slavery. And of course, there's quotes in his debates with Douglas and in other places that can be put out there. There's the book Forced into Glory,
Yes.
in which he's described, not only is he described as basically just your general white supremacist, but the entire reason he's famous is just kind of created by whites to make whites feel good, and that blacks never liked him particularly, according to that book. And now we have 13therism, in which the 13th Amendment has taken on this dark subterranean connotation of a trick of evil. And how do you deal with these combative things when you're trying to teach about Lincoln? But as you write in your book, you're not trying to apologize for Lincoln. You're talking about Lincoln when he says things that we wouldn't appreciate today, and you're talking about the accomplishments that he brought forth.
I think I want to respond two ways. First of all, I want to acknowledge Lincoln made mistakes. All right, I haven't heard the earth crumbling all around me. The tectonic plates are not shaking. He made mistakes. That's because he's a human being. He makes mistakes. I make mistakes. In fact, I've had one very good friend write to me to point out, you made a mistake on page so and so. And it's one of, I'm sorry, it was one of those very obvious blunders. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. It's too obvious. It's just one of those things you're not thinking when you're writing. Put the date in there. And you look at it and you say, what? My mind must have been wandering at that moment. Yes, you make mistakes. I make mistakes. And Lincoln made mistakes, sometimes important ones. But I also know that he got a great deal right. And he was understood that way too. Let me give you an example. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in the fourth debate at Charleston, Illinois, Lincoln has the lead off in the speeches that are given. And he leads off with a statement that has been held against him, not only by Lerone Bennett in Forced into Glory, but by many others. And that is, he says, I have no interest, no plan to establish social or political equality between the races. You read that and you think, what? Lerone Bennett himself said many years ago that that was exactly what jolted him out of what otherwise he had been raised to participate in as Lincoln worship. And you read that and you, in cold type and you think, what? I thought this was the great emancipator. And yet he seems to be a man here who gives you a view of racial relations indistinguishable from Bull Connor. But read on. Read on, in which he says he doesn't believe in social and political equality of the races, but in the right of the black man to eat the bread that he has earned with the sweat of his brow. He is my equal, Judge Douglas's equal, and the equal of every living man. And you think, what does he mean by this? Well, it's because it's very conventional in the 19th century and conventional for Lincoln to understand that there's two ways of talking about equality. One way of talking about equality is absolute, and that is equality of natural rights. That's what Jefferson writes about in the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson speaks of all men being created equal, in what respect does he mean that? He means those natural rights that are hardwired into everyone. Rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Everyone is born with those rights, and everyone is born with the same quantity of those rights. And Lincoln is saying, in terms of those natural rights, the black man is my equal, Judge Douglas is equal, and the equal of every living man. Now, social and political rights, it's a different category. And we actually observe that today. If we want to talk about inequality of political rights, David, I suffer from an inequality of political rights. I'm going to tell you why. In the Constitution of the United States, it is specified that the president has to be a natural born citizen of the United States, not just a citizen, but a natural born citizen. This is why there was so much of the birther controversy about Barack Obama many years ago. I was born in Japan. My father was US military, and I was born in Yokohama, Japan. I can't be president of the United States. That is a political right that other American citizens have, but I don't. It was taken away from me by the Constitution. So I could say, oh, well, that means the whole American experiment is wrong. I don't have equal political rights. No, it simply means that the Constitution has this provision. If I want the whole constitutional bargain, I have to accept that. And believe me, there have been many generations of students who have been so glad for that provision in the Constitution. So there's an example right there. Does that mean that I am not equal in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and other constitutional rights? No. In fact, what we have happening, as soon as someone starts to talk about equality of natural rights, the boundary between that and social and political rights turns out to be a surprisingly porous one. So when Lincoln says, I believe in the natural equality of black and white. Now, I don't necessarily believe in any kind of equality beyond that. Listen to how his opponent, Stephen Douglas, responds to that. Because Douglas saw exactly where that was going to head. Douglas responds to Lincoln's statement by saying, not good enough. As soon as you grant the natural equality of the races, then you're on a path towards political and social equality. So if you want political and social equality between the races, vote for Mr. Lincoln. Now, Douglas is assuming that his audiences there in Illinois in 1858 are going to revolt at that. And many of them did. But Douglas saw much more clearly, I'm afraid, than some of the Lincoln haters. Douglas saw very clearly, maybe he saw it clearly for the first and only time in his life, but he saw very clearly where Lincoln, talking about that natural equality, was going to take things. And then watch what happens when Lincoln is president. One of the things that I think does not surprise people enough is that Lincoln invites Black people to the White House. He invites a delegation in August of 1862, and he talks to them about colonization. All right, that's another sore point. The thing is, he invites them to come and talk about it. And then beyond that, he plays host to a galaxy of Black American leaders. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. All of these are people who meet Abraham Lincoln. And how do they describe their meeting with Lincoln? Frederick Douglass, the first time that he met Abraham Lincoln, came away from the meeting. He went to the home of John Eaton. And he was very excited. He said, I can't believe what I've just been through. I've been with the President of the United States. And he spoke to me as one gentleman would speak to another gentleman. This is the first time something like this has happened with an important white man. And he's so excited about this that when he speaks that December to the convention of the American Anti-Slavery Society, he describes Lincoln in exactly those terms. Lincoln invites Black leaders to the White House. By 1864, Black church associations are holding fundraising picnics on the White House grounds. And after Lincoln's death, Frederick Douglass describes him in a eulogy that he gives at the Cooper Institute. And he speaks of Lincoln as preeminently the colored man's president. So what you see in Lincoln is that fundamental idea first of natural equality. And everything that Lincoln does from that point onwards, everything that flows downwards from that, points him in directions and takes him to destinations that only work themselves out further and further in terms of social and political equality. Stephen Douglas, it has to be said, Stephen Douglas had it right, again, maybe for the only time in his life. He saw exactly where Lincoln was going. And if we have to speculate into the future of what things might have been like if Lincoln had lived and given supervision to the beginnings of Reconstruction, I think it's really very, very plain that Lincoln would have put his shoulder to the wheel for Black voting rights, for Black economic expansion. I think all of these are directions in which he would have pushed the country.
Well, let me ask you to leave the people with just your last comment. As we're talking today, we're leading up to a presidential election that people are not feeling too thrilled about for the most part. The two sides aren't talking to each other. And according to polls, for the first time, there's a substantial amount of people who are willing to discard democracy. There are some that feel that it isn't bringing about equality. There's some who feeling it just bends over backwards for minority views. And for the first time, people are saying, yeah, we can move on from this. So what is your message to these people after the research and the thought you've put into this book on Lincoln and democracy?
I would put a question back to them. Move on to what? To what do we move on from democracy? Lincoln thought about this question, and he thought about it fairly early in his career in a speech he gives in 1838, the Lyceum speech. And there he says, if we are going to set aside democracy, and he's saying this in 1838 because the previous year had been pockmarked with rioting, with mob actions, lynchings. And he says, if we're going to set aside democracy, then what is going to be the alternative? When you set aside the norms of democracy, when you resort to violence, when you resort to aggression, when you resort to silencing and shaming, what becomes the result? Ordinary people become disgusted. And I think we're hearing some elements of disgust this way, just as you've described, David. People become disgusted. And if they become disgusted long enough, what they'll do is they'll turn to what Lincoln called someone of the tribe of the eagle, an Alexander the Great, a Julius Caesar, someone who promises to ride in on a white horse and bring order to the chaos of affairs. And at that moment, what you get is not a return to democracy. What you get is the establishment of dictatorship and despotism. Think, is that what we want? Is that really the solution? Is authoritarian rule of whatever description and whatever dimension, is that really going to be the cure? And the answer is always no. People sometimes think that the answer to problems is power. If only we had the power to do this or do that, which often becomes, if only we had the power to silence him or her, or the power to eliminate them or those. The difficulty with power is that power is toxic. Power poisons the people who use it. This is why the founders, in creating the Constitution, understood that, all right, you can't do without some elements of power in any kind of regime. Someone's got to keep the traffic lights working. You got to have some power. But what you want to do is maximize liberty. You got to treat power as though it was a radioactive element. Tremendous results from it, but still the threat of poisoning. So you minimize power. You don't get rid of it entirely. You minimize it so that you can maximize liberty. Lincoln has the same understanding of things. It's a mistake to think that if you would just give power to so-and-so, to lock this one up or to silence that one there, that would be the cure of things. No, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't. Because that inevitably gives you despotism, but even worse, it gives you stupidity. I often say to people, one of the great problems about power is not only that it poisons you personally, it poisons personally the people who exercise it. It makes you stupid. Because if you have that much power, nobody can come to you and point out that you're making a mistake. They'd be afraid to. You do not want to live in an environment where power governs at all points. You don't want to live in a monarchy with a powerful king. You don't want to live in a dictatorship with a powerful despot. You don't even want to live in an environment where one party or one group of people possesses power to control others, because they will only end up committing folly. What you want is a democracy. And what you want is a sense of patience. The democracy makes mistakes. It does stupid things from time to time. It gets carried away. Yeah, I know it does. And yet, I remember the comment of Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst form of government ever invented, except for all the other forms of government that have been invented. And all you can say is, oh, 'tis true, 'tis true. So my counsel to people today, I think, would be this. If I'm really in a position, a person who should be handing out advice like this, is a word of patience. Patience with democracy. There is an infinite amount of harm we can do by deserting that cause, but an infinite amount of good that we can do by regaining, restoring, practicing again our loyalty to it. That, in fact, is what Lincoln believed the Civil War was about. He said to his secretary in 1861, what is really at stake in this Civil War, more than constitutional niceties, more even than slavery itself, so this is a question of whether people can govern themselves, whether this thing called democracy is not just condemned to fly off by its own centrifugal force into pieces. He says, we have to show that people, in fact, ordinary people, are capable of governing themselves. And that's what he had to say, in fact, at Gettysburg, when he said, we are undergoing a test whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. How do we pass that test? All right, I'm going to give away the answer. The answer to the final exam says you dedicate yourself. Lincoln says you dedicate yourself to those principles. You dedicate yourself to government of, by, and for the people. And if that will happen, then we will indeed have a new birth of freedom. Not a birth of new freedom, as Richard Brookhiser very wisely points out. We're not going to change things and throw out democracy and get something entirely different. No, we're going to have a new birth of freedom. We're going to have a rebirth of the original principles of democracy. And if that can occur, if we are willing to do that, if we're willing to work and to work with patience, to work and to wait and to hope, if we can do that, then we will indeed have that new birth of freedom, and it, in turn, will lead to a government of, by, and for the people, which shall not perish from the earth. That, fundamentally, I believe, is Lincoln's message to us today.
I am speaking with Allen C. Guelzo about his new book, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. Thank you so much for being on my show.
Thank you, David.